Hey everybody, it's Rothbar's Disciple. I'm here showing you guys how to write simple Bitcoin apps here. So what we're going to be working on today is creating a file. I'm actually going to just close this. Sure, whatever. We'll save that as an empty one because we're actually uh, writing on files. This was the old code that we did in the last one. We're just going to delete that. And again, I still have the old code saved, the simple hash. That's what I resaved this as. So I don't ever delete my code from one thing to the next for the simple fact that you're going to need to relearn how to do something at some point, so it's always easier to go back and look at your old code. But one of the things that you got to know about programs that you create is whenever you create a program, everything you do within that program is done within the random access memory, which just means when you close the program, all that memory is gone. So there are certain things that you actually want to have stored long term, and if you want to store things long term, you have to store them in a file. Okay, so files are actually pretty simple within Python. All you do is you create a variable, and we're going to create our variable as the YouTube test file. Um, oh, actually, we're going to create our variable just as input file. It's easier. When you create input file, again, input file is just a variable, but we want our variable to open a file and do something within the file. So the function you use, it's just open, and again, with any function, you have parentheses here. And then with files, when you tell it to open a file, first you have to tell it which file to open. So we're going to open a file that we're going to call YouTube test file, right? And so you put this name within parentheses, okay? And make sure you get parentheses on both sides. The nice thing again about idle is it changes the colors of things. So if I forgot to put in these parentheses and I kept writing, it's all in green. And that tells me, look, you're still writing the name of the file, right? So we want our name to be YouTube test file, and then you put parentheses on both sides, and then you put a comma. So the first thing you tell it within the parentheses is which file to open. The second thing you tell it is what to do. Now, what we're going to be doing right now is we're going to be writing into this file, and I'm going to show you specifically how the writing into the file works. And when you write into a file, you use W. Again, when you tell it what you want to do with the file, you tell it within parentheses. Um, and so uh, because this file doesn't already exist, so you can see here there's no YouTube test file here. There's a lot of different files that I have, but there's no YouTube test file, right? So the file doesn't exist, so we're going to tell it W plus, which just means if, or the W means we're going to write in this file. The plus means if the file doesn't already exist, we're going to create it, okay? So now anytime I call up that variable and I say input file, it opens this file, right? So if I want to do something to this file, if I want to write something to this file, I write, or what I use actually is input file dot write is the function, and then I have to put quote, or I'm going to just put in some sort of string in here, and I'm just going to write string. Okay. Pretty simple. Now, if I were to run this alone is not enough. I want to show you guys one of the most common mistakes you'll have when you're writing in files. If you just write, see how this thing is still circling? It means that I'm not done with the file yet. I don't think anything will show up in here. Yeah, nothing's going to show up in here, okay? And the reason why is that I've opened the file, and the file is actually still technically, I think, open within this program. What I need to do is after you're done with the file, always make sure to, again, you write the name of the variable that you had, which was to open the file, and then you write close, okay? So whenever you do something to the file, once you're done with it, you need to make sure to do close. And again, close is one of those functions where you don't actually necessarily tell it anything. There might actually be something you can put in there, but we're not putting anything in there. And see how there was the circle, the refresh circle going on there, but now it's gone. So when I open this up, it should say whatever we wrote in there, which was string, and so it shows up correctly, right? Now, one of the interesting things about when you write things to a file, I don't know why I have all these up here. When you write something to a file, it erases everything that was in that file before. So we're going to, instead of write string, actually I'll just write second string. You might expect it to have string in the file, and then you might expect it to say second string, But what we will see is that all it says is second string. So what happens, or how do you get a file to save not only what you put in the first time, but what you put in the second time? Because again, if we're hashing things, or if we're trying to create a file that stores data that we're eventually going to hash, you're going, it's going to be used by a user more than one time. And if you're talking about something like tweets, you tweet more than one time before you're going to end up hashing those tweets and putting them on the blockchain. So you need to make sure that the file's not deleting older tweets. And so the way you actually do that is, instead of writing to a file, you put A in there. A means append. Okay, so append means you add this to the file that already exists. So if we look at our file that we have here, and we already have second string sitting in this file, we want it to keep that in there. Again, it's a little confusing because the first thing we have written in there is second string. But now that we're appending the file, I'll go ahead and switch this to where it says third string. When I run this, and I misspelled there, but that's sort of irrelevant. So I ran that, and it should add, as long as I actually ran that, it adds my third string here. But now you're looking at this and you're like, okay, this is not nice, because it just adds it directly onto the file, right? And it'd be nicer, especially if you're talking about hashing something, like if I try and copy this and hash it, using my hash tool, because again, you always want to think about things from the way that the user is going to use it. If I paste this, it gives me one hash, but what I actually want, if I were trying to hash these two things, is I would want two hashes. So instead of having the two hashes, or the two data points put together all in one string, I actually want the next one to have a new line on it, right? And so the way you do this within Python, it's very simple. You write in whatever the string is that you would want, and then again, whenever you're working with strings, you can add strings together. It just means put this on the end of it. We're going to put new line, and so this one where we say third string, we're going to run this again. It should say second string, third string on the top line, because that's what the file already said, and then it'll say third string on the bottom. Hopefully I didn't change anything when I opened the file earlier when we looked at it. Ooh, that did not work. Let me go ahead and look at my code here. I guess I'm going to put these together. We'll go ahead and see how this works. Okay, so that one added in the new line, which is what we want. Okay, so after each one that you want, or you want a new line. Actually, I can tell you right now why this first one went to the top. If we go back and look at our code here, just so you guys know, we have our new line at the end. So when we ran that for the third time, it did probably put in a new line. And if you look at it, actually, I can click down here. So it did add the new line before, but we're adding the new line on the tweet before. So when we add our third string in here, we go here, and then it goes to a new line. So the next thing that it writes, it's already ready to write it here. So when we added the new line on the first one, if I wanted this first one to be down here, what I actually would have needed to do is put the new line in there before. But since we already have the new line at the end, like, that'll work. So I'm going to go ahead and clear this. Again, I've said this before, when you're working with your files, if you have important data in there, you never clear and save this stuff ever in your life. But now if I type things in here, I'm going to put in first string, and this should, again, I'm going to put in first string, so we ran the first string already. I'm going to put in second string here, and if we did this correctly, which it should be all correct, we will have, within our file, we will have 3 lines actually, but 2 lines with words on them, okay? And it looks like when I saved it, I had saved, the one thing again with files is when you save things, they're saved forever, so I saved it with a new line to start with, and so it actually wrote on the second line. Okay, the best way to do this is just not to mess with your files and write it correctly from the start. But as you can see, again, if we keep on adding things here, we will always have this new line as we go on. Okay, so it's always going to be adding things into the new line of this file. Now, the one thing you got to be careful with something like this is if you're trying to pull out everything here, it might actually pull out this fourth line as something that exists here, even though this fourth line maybe does not actually exist. Um, that's something to keep in mind. It doesn't really matter for our example here, but new lines can be a little bit tricky. The other thing um, about files is you can actually pull things out of files, and when you pull things out of files, like if I want to pull like this first string up here looks like it just says first string, but technically speaking, it actually like the string itself has everything in here. So if I try to pull out this first item of this list, it'll actually keep that new line in there. So that's something to remember for when we go on. But this is just how you create files. The other thing too is, again, what you actually want to do with anything you're creating, you'll do things like input data. We're going to create some data that we're going to input into this file, and we're just going to, again, we use the input function because we always want to be asking our user for input, and it's just, we're going to say input new data into the file. And again, I like to add my new line here because it looks good in the shell. And so now when we want our input file to write something, instead of writing third string or whatever we tell it to write, we're going to have it input what the input data, or we're going to have it write the input data which our user has given us, and then we're going to add our new line. And again, like I said before, when you're actually creating this within whatever program you're using, when you're using new lines, always remember that these new lines actually show up. Like, it doesn't show up in the file, you don't see it here, but again, because we're adding a new line after each one of these, we actually have 4 lines here. So if you were hashing something from this, it becomes important. These new lines that you put in there become important, and actually if you were to hash something from a file, you have to take the new line out of there. That's a little more advanced than we're going to go in this video. All we're trying to show you is how to put data into a file that a user gives you and just keep it going. Okay, so again, it gives us input data into the new file. I'm going to put QWERTY. Okay, hit enter. Now, when I go down here, hopefully if everything worked out, it's added QWERTY. And again, because there's a new line, this bottom line here exists. Okay, I can't go any lower than that bottom line. I can go up and I can go down, and that's all the farther it goes. So we need to remember, because we added a new line, we technically speaking have 5 lines here. This 5th line is completely empty, so we'd have to see how that works, in the programs we're doing later on. But that's a very simple introduction of how do you create a file and how do you add things to this file. It's just all right here. It's all very simple. Again, we're just asking the user to input data into here. And again, always remember, whenever you do anything with a file, make sure to do close at the end, otherwise it's going to screw you up. But anyways, that's the real simple introduction into creating files and adding data to files. So I hope you enjoyed it. There will be more coming out soon.